This video deals with the economic effects of automation and their policy challenges, and it is based on standard macroeconomic frameworks that are augmented by a new production factor that resembles the properties of automation technologies. Before we delve into this topic, it's important to recall the definition of automation, which is an automatically controlled operation that takes the place of human elements of observation, effort, and decision-making according to standard dictionaries. So it's really important that automation takes the place of human work in production. It's not like the standard labor-augmenting technological progress where it increases the productivity of the workers, such as we had it in the past. Now, this feature of automation capital is best illustrated by comparing two pictures here. The first one is from 100 years ago in Ford's car factory, where we see human workers along an assembly line, which I call the traditional form of physical capital. And you see there is a complementarity in production. So you need both production factors, you need human workers, and you need this assembly line in order to be able to produce output. And this is what we capture usually nicely with our Cobb-Douglas production function, where we have capital and labor, but one of the two production factors alone is not able to produce output. Now, if you Google modern car factory, the picture that you will find resembles usually something like the picture that you see here, where you don't see any workers along the assembly line. Instead, what you see is two types of physical capital: the traditional physical capital, the assembly line, and the automation capital, the industrial robots producing output. And this, of course, has huge consequences for economic production, because for the first time, actually, it's possible to produce without the production factor labor. And this, of course, is not captured by the standard Cobb-Douglas production function. Instead, we have to augment it. And as you can imagine already, if we augment it by such automation capital, you certainly get many features that you cannot have with the standard Cobb-Douglas production function, such as that you can overcome the diminishing marginal product with respect to physical capital. And therefore, as we will see in a Solowian type of growth model, you have the possibility of perpetual economic growth, even assuming away any other labor augmenting technological progress. What are examples of these automation capital stocks? The first one is immediate, and we've just seen it. It's industrial robots that substitute for humans in mass production. But there is also automation in customized production, for example, through 3D printers that are well suited, for example, to produce certain smaller parts that are needed on an infrequent basis, but have to be adjusted to certain configurations, or medical implants, for example, prostheses or hearing aids, actually. And their 3D printers are already used on a large scale. Autonomous driving is another form that is basically reported a lot about in the news. And the fourth one, machine learning and artificial intelligence, makes clear that automation is not only replacing low-skilled workers, but it's also starting to replace high-skilled workers. So, for example, diagnosing diseases is done very well by machine learning algorithms that kind of have a comparative advantage in pattern recognition. And matching symptoms with diseases is basically nothing else than such a pattern recognition. IBM Watson, for example, is better in recognizing particularly rare diseases that doctors barely see in their daily routine than doctors are. Then writing reports, news flashes, that's done frequently by robots, and even novels have already been written by such algorithms, and even doing science. So there was a publication in 29 in Science that showed that the machine learning algorithm was able to deduce the laws of mechanics by observing the data of a coupled pendulum. That automation is indeed a comparatively new phenomenon is further made clear by this graph here that traces the worldwide operative stock of industrial robots, and the data is from the International Federation of Robotics, where we see that throughout the 1970s and most of the 1980s, the stock of industrial robots was actually negligible. Then there was kind of increase in the growth rate, but it was rather sluggish initially. And only in the last 10 years or so, we really observed a takeoff and growth rates at the order of 10 to 15% per year. But irrespective of these high growth rates that we observed back then, we are not yet there where we would have 4 million industrial robots worldwide. And if you consider that one industrial robot can substitute by about 3 to 6 workers, then the amount of workers that the worldwide operative industrial robots can substitute at the moment is still comparatively low as compared to the global workforce, for example. But of course, this is an aggregate picture, and we know that some countries are forerunners in the adoption of robots, so they have more industrial robots per 1,000 or 10,000 manufacturing workers than others do. So this map here shows the global distribution of industrial robots taken out of a paper by Anna Belyansky and me from 2022. And what you see on this map is that, of course, richer countries adopted more industrial robots so far. That's not so surprising because these countries are typically the ones that adopt the new technologies first. And there also wages are high, so it pays off to substitute workers by robots. And low-income countries, mostly in Southern America, Africa, and Asia, have a low robot density. So these countries with a lighter color here. The countries with a white color, basically we don't have data, but that's quite strongly linked also to employing just a few or no industrial robots at all. So the central explanation is that the richer countries adopted the robots, industrial robots first, but even among the richer countries there are certain differences, and these can be traced back to demographic differences between the different countries, because the countries that adopt most of the industrial robots are the ones that are aging fastest, such as Germany, Italy, Japan, South Korea, and so on and so forth. And this can be well explained theoretically and empirically, and has been done, for example, by Acemoglu and Restrepo, or in the paper with Anna Belyansky. We have also done that. So after having sketched out the basic stylized facts of automation, we now want to proceed and ask ourselves what the economic effects of automation are, particularly on 4 different aspects. The first is productivity growth and income, because as we adopt this new technology, we could expect that this has an effect on productivity growth and income growth. Second, on the distribution of income between the production factors, capital and labor. Also here an effect can be conjectured, because robots are essentially physical capital, so the income that they earn goes to the capital owners, but in the production process they are perfect substitutes for workers, and therefore they compete with workers and hold their wages down. So that means nothing else than that there could be a shift from the labor income share to the capital income share, and we want to ask whether this can be analyzed theoretically. The third one is income inequality more generally, and also here it's straightforward to pose this question, because low-skilled tasks can still be easier automated than high-skilled tasks up to now. And finally, the most important question in this context that is posed by many, and policymakers, the media, and the public is concerned about it, whether automation will lead to mass unemployment. And as I said, I would like to address these 4 questions with very simple economic frameworks, compare the predictions of these simple frameworks with the empirical evidence that we have so far, and later on I will show that the results basically that the basic economic frameworks predict, they also hold true in more sophisticated depictions, such as endogenous R&D-based economic growth models with endogenous skill upgrading, and that makes it further clear that there is something to these developments, basically. So I start here by using a simple Solow model of economic growth, and introduce to the Solow model of economic growth a production factor that is a perfect substitute for labor, but is in essence physical capital. So in the standard Solow growth model, we have that final output is produced with workers with an output elasticity of 1 minus alpha, and traditional physical capital with an output elasticity of alpha. But now what we have is that automation makes it possible to substitute for workers perfectly. So that's captured here by this sum between workers and robots, automation capital. And therefore I introduced this additional production factor, and everything else is standard except for the automation capital. And we see here immediately that this automation capital actually leads to a situation where the diminishing returns of traditional physical capital can be overcome by the accumulation of automation capital. So if one solves for the long run growth rate of such an extended Solow model, then one does not get the standard solution that without technological progress, economic growth is necessarily zero. Instead, there are two different equilibria. One is still the equilibrium in the traditional Solow growth model, the stagnation equilibrium, but there is a second one in which perpetual economic growth is possible, and perpetual economic growth in this equilibrium would depend positively on the saving or investment rate, because it's clear that is what increases the accumulation of physical capital and automation capital, and overall there would be constant returns to scale with respect to the accumulation of overall capital because of this automation capital with an output elasticity of 1 minus alpha, and traditional physical capital having an output elasticity of alpha. So together the output elasticity is 1. And it decreases with depreciation and capital dilution, the two factors that actually slow down capital accumulation in the Solow growth model. And then we have a parameter cluster that is in between 0 and 1, irrespective of whether you solve the model under the assumption that you have rational investors that decide rationally of how much you want to invest in traditional physical capital and automation capital. So that would be the solution in this case. Or if you assume that there's just mechanic accumulation of the two types of capital, then you would have a share that goes to the traditional physical capital stock and the share that goes to the automation capital stock. Nevertheless, this would then also be a parameter cluster that is between 0 and 1. But the main result here is perpetual growth becomes possible due to automation in the Solow model without technological progress. So this is summarized here in this result box. That's the first insight that we can get from introducing automation capital into the Solow model. Perpetual growth becomes possible, even though we assume a way standard labor augmenting technological progress. So automation as such is a driving force of productivity growth, and this is in line with the empirical evidence, for example, presented in Gretz and Michaels in 2018, the paper of Review of Economics and Statistics, where they show that the accumulation of automation capital, or this increase in the number of industrial robots that we've observed in the past decades, actually has increased productivity and incomes on average. So this productivity effect would of course be rather positive. However, we know that people are afraid of some of the distributional consequences and particularly also of unemployment. So what we do also is to analyze what happens in the model to the functional income distribution and the personal income distribution. The first here is for this, to analyze this, we have to derive the factor rewards, the wage rate and the interest rate, and that's basically the marginal value product of the corresponding production factor. So from here it's the derivative of the production function with respect to the number of workers, that's the wage rate, and the derivative of the production function with respect to physical capital is the marginal product of physical capital. If we subtract the rate of depreciation, we get the interest rate. And the remuneration of robots is basically also the wage rate because they are perfect substitutes. So we can derive the wage rate and the interest rate. And what we see is that actually the wage rate is increasing with traditional physical capital. That's what we know in the standard model. But actually it's decreasing with automation capital. And the reason is clear. Automation capital is a perfect substitute for labor and therefore competes directly with the robots on the labor market. By contrast, the automation capital accumulation would ceteris paribus lead to an increase in the interest rate. Well, and then we know in the standard Solow growth model, the labor income share, which is the wage rate multiplied by the number of workers divided by total output, is always constant and equal to 1 minus alpha, irrespective of what happens in the economy, whether we are in the transition phase or in the long-run solution or whatever, the labor income share would be constant. Now with automation, this changes. So if we solve for the labor income share with this wage rate, then what we get is 1 minus alpha, as in the standard Solow model, but then multiplied with a term that depends negatively on the accumulation of automation capital. So we see here the labor income share would decrease with automation, and we've observed the decreasing in labor income share actually since the 1980s. Now what makes this augmented model so appealing is that until the 1980s, the number of industrial robots worldwide was negligible, so P was close to 0. In this case, this term would drop out and we would have the standard Solow solution of a constant labor income share. So the model can explain what we observed over longer parts of human history. But then since the 1980s, there was an accumulation of automation capital, and therefore the labor income share in the model would decrease. And that's what we observe since the 1980s. So therefore, the model can explain the reduction in the labor income share as we have seen it basically described by Karababunis and Neiman in their paper in 2014, or also as it has been empirically analyzed by Eden and Gackel in an article in the Review of Economic Dynamics in 2018, where they show that an increase in automation actually decreases the labor income share, although they measure automation by information and communication technologies and not by the accumulation of industrial robots as it is usually done. Nevertheless, the results are in line, and automation, according to their empirical results, would reduce the labor income share, and that's also what the Solow model augmented by automation technology predicts. Now, what about wage inequality? So far, we couldn't say anything about wage inequality, of course, because there was only one type of labor, so no heterogeneity with respect to wages. However, in a paper with Lankish and co-authors, what we do is we consider an extension of the model by low-skilled workers and high-skilled workers. The high-skilled workers are denoted by LH, the low-skilled workers by LL, and robots are now a perfect substitute for the low-skilled workers, so they can perfectly substitute people at the assembly line, for example, if we want to make this interpretation, but the robots cannot perfectly substitute high-skilled workers. They can substitute for them, but only to the degree that low-skilled and high-skilled workers are substitutes, and that's steered by the parameter gamma that kind of influences the elasticity of substitution between low-skilled and high-skilled workers. Apart from that, the production function is still Cobb-Douglas overall in this kind of term for aggregate labor, including automation and traditional physical capital. So it's a straightforward extension, basically. For this, we can again derive the production factors remuneration, the wages of high-skilled workers and the wages of low-skilled workers. But since these expressions are comparatively long, I omitted them here and just present the skill premium, actually, which is the wage of high-skilled workers divided by the wage rate of low-skilled workers. And we see here again that this increases with the accumulation of automation capital. So again, as obvious from this expression, automation raises the skill premium and would imply higher wage inequality. And that's intuitively clear because up to now at least, automation capital can easier substitute for low-skilled workers, for example, at the assembly line, than for high-skilled workers. So there it's still more difficult than in the comparatively routine tasks. So to summarize the effect here, automation can explain the rise in the skill premium that we've observed, and therefore it can explain an increase in wage inequality, as it has also been observed since the 1980s, which is described, for example, in all the work by Thomas Piketty and co-authors and collaborators. And it's also in line with empirical evidence that this is actually driven by automation, or to some degree driven by automation. For example, Gretz and Michaels and Asimoglu and Restrepo show that low-skilled workers are more affected by automation than high-skilled workers, and that this actually increases wage inequality. Next, what about the employment effects? Here things are not so clear actually, because there are many different ways of introducing unemployment in such models. Of course, straightforward thing to do is to introduce elastic labor supply in the models that I just presented. And here, voluntary unemployment would actually increase as automation progresses. So voluntary unemployment becomes then a second margin to adjust when automation takes place. The other one was the wage, so we would have two margins of adjustment then. But this is arguably not so interesting, so people are typically not very much interested in the effects of automation on voluntary unemployment, but more on involuntary unemployment. Now one can introduce involuntary unemployment in these types of growth models by including some sort of efficiency wages, that wages, at least for one group, are paid that are higher than the market clearing wage, and then there is involuntary unemployment in equilibrium, and then one can analyze what happens if automation capital increases. And what happens when you do this is actually that you can show that in the long run, technological progress would indeed raise technological unemployment. So automation would lead to an increase in technological unemployment. However, the story looks quite differently if one introduces automation into a standard search and matching model of the labor market with low-skilled and high-skilled workers. In this case, I showed together with Dario Kortz in a paper published in the Oxford Economic Papers that actually frictional unemployment would even fall if automation takes place. And the reason is that the matching on the low-skilled labor market in this case becomes more efficient, and therefore you have more firm creation, and the workers that become unemployed in the low-skilled labor market, there are, in exchange, many workers that become employed in the high-skilled labor market, and overall the situation can emerge that the job creation for the high-skilled labor market even compensates for the job loss of the low-skilled labor market. So overall, it's not so clear, no clear-cut results emerge. It depends quite a lot on which underlying framework one uses to analyze the effects of automation on unemployment. But surprisingly enough, this is actually again consistent with the empirical evidence, because in the empirical evidence there are also not the clear-cut results that we've seen previously. Acemoglu and Restrepo, for example, in their paper in 2020, find negative effects, negative employment effects of automation for the United States. And actually, automation leads to quite a large increase in unemployment, according to their findings. By contrast, Dowd and co-authors use the same methodology, but for German data, and they find negligible overall effects. So there in Germany, automation did not seem to increase unemployment by much. And even more, Gregory and co-authors in 2022 find that there can even be positive employment effects, and find this basically within European countries. So also the empirical evidence is inconclusive here, and this matches again with the theoretical considerations that are also inconclusive, where it depends a lot on which underlying model of unemployment one uses. So far, we've seen the standard implications that emerge by introducing automation capital into the Solowian type of growth model or some of its extensions. Now what I will show is that these results hold true in a more sophisticated framework where we have endogenous economic growth and endogenous skill upgrading, basically. So here I follow the paper with Holger Struhlig in the Journal of Monetary Economics, where we assume that there is an overlapping generations economy in which individuals live for 3 time periods. In youth, they don't make economic decisions, they get basic education by compulsory schooling, and they get consumption from their parents. In the working age, people decide upon how much of their income they want to save and how much they want to consume, and they basically save for retirement, so the third phase in an individual's life cycle. And they make a second decision, and that is whether or not they want to upgrade their skills, so whether or not they want to obtain a university or college degree. Depending on this choice, there are then 3 production factors in the economy. The low-skilled workers, these are the ones who chose not to upgrade their skills. They perform comparatively routine tasks, are easy to automate, are substitutes to machines, and we conceptualize them as being the assembly line workers that work only in goods production. We call them L-types. Then there are the ones that chose to obtain a college degree. They are high-skilled. They are difficult to automate, are rather complements to machines, and we call them H-types and think of them as either engineers if they work in the goods production sector or scientists if they work in the research and development sector. And we have physical capital in the form of the machines or robots that we have in the model. The utility function is type dependent, so J is the type of the person, so either low-skilled or high-skilled, and utility increases with consumption in the second period of life when the people make the decisions, and in the third period of life when people are retired and their consumption is nothing else than savings carried over from the previous period multiplied by the interest factor, which we assume to be constant, and this is discounted with the discount factor beta. So that's kind of the standard part of the utility function. But we also have rather non-standard part, and that is the disutility of effort that people have to invest if they obtain a college degree. So here we assume heterogeneity of workers. People have different abilities, A, and there is an ability distribution in the population. So there are people who have higher abilities, people with lower abilities, and those with higher abilities have to exert less effort to obtain a college degree than the ones with lower abilities, which is kind of a reasonable assumption. And abilities can be normally distributed, for example, as is the IQ. And then we have the budget constraint. There is again a standard part that consumption expenditures and savings must not exceed wage income, but we also allow for a wage tax, tau W, that we will use later on to simulate redistribution policies towards the low-skilled workers, the losers from automation. Then we have a second cost of education, that's the opportunity cost. So if I choose to obtain a college degree, I cannot spend the amount of time eta working. Instead, I have to spend the amount eta on obtaining a college degree. So the opportunity cost of a college degree is a fraction eta of the second period, of the time that is available in the second period to workers. And then we have a redistribution, so a transfer, Tj, that is type dependent, so we can model with this transfer a transfer towards low-skilled workers, or we can model an education subsidy, which would be a transfer to high-skilled workers. And the solution to this optimization problem is straightforward, so we have that consumption and savings both increase with income, while consumption decreases with the discount factor and savings increase with the discount factor, because with an increase in the discount factor, people become more patient, so they would save more, ceteris paribus. Then we have the second decision of whether or not to upgrade the skills. And this decision is made by comparing the utility level that a person can achieve without a college degree with the utility level that a person can achieve with the college degree. And that pins down to comparing the disutility that is connected to effort to obtain a college degree with the skill premium in terms of utility. So the skill premium in terms of income is here within square brackets. That's the income of high-skilled workers versus divided by the income of low-skilled workers. And if we take the logarithm and add 1 plus beta here, that's then the skill premium in terms of utility. And if this is higher than the disutility of effort, then a person chooses to obtain a college degree, and if it's lower, the person chooses not to obtain a college degree. And with that, we can graphically analyze the evolution of the share of the people with a college degree. That depends on this skill premium in terms of utility, W tilde. So if W tilde is 0, nobody gets educated, and the share 1 of the population remains low-skilled. As the skill premium increases, however, a greater and greater share of the population starts to get educated. For this particular skill premium here, it would be the share 1 minus AT star. And then the share increases further for a normally distributed ability level. And then we assume that there is, however, a certain ability threshold, A bar, below which people cannot obtain a college degree, or below which they would need so much time in the second period of their life that they won't have any time to work anymore. And this ability threshold can be arbitrarily low, but that it exists, I think, is a reasonable assumption. So that fully describes the consumption side of the economy. Now we come to the production side, and here we assume that final goods production takes place with machines with an output elasticity alpha and high-skilled workers with an output elasticity 1 minus alpha. They are to some degree complementary to machines, so these are the engineers that work in final goods production. And we don't have only one machine, we have as many machine varieties as we have technologies in the economy. So the technological state of the economy is described by AT. So if you will, the oldest vintage of machines is 1 and the newest vintage of machines or robots is AT. So that's fairly standard, but what you also have is low-skilled workers, and they are, as compared to high-skilled workers, rather substitutes to machines here. And from that production function that assumes low-skilled workers are assembly line workers that can be easily substituted by robots, while high-skilled workers would be the engineers that maintain the robots, we can derive the factor rewards, the wages for high-skilled workers as the marginal product of the production factor LH, the wages of low-skilled workers as the marginal product of the production factor LL, and the inverse demand function for robots PI. Now, the wage rate for high-skilled workers is fairly standard, as in the standard Roma-Jones type of growth models. It increases with technological progress, so high-skilled workers benefit by technological progress, and therefore it also increases with GDP, with economic growth. Low-skilled workers' wages, by contrast, do not directly benefit from technological progress, as we see here, or from economic growth, because their wages solely depend on the ratio between high-skilled workers in the final goods sector and low-skilled workers in the final goods sector. However, the wages of low-skilled workers benefit indirectly from technological progress, because as technologies progress, the skill premium would increase, and this increasing skill premium would induce some low-skilled workers to become high-skilled and to obtain a college degree, to upgrade their skills. And in this case, the wages of low-skilled workers would also grow during the transition. Only in the long run, when we hit the ability threshold, the wages of low-skilled workers would stagnate, while the wages of high-skilled workers would still increase with technological progress, as we will see later on. And so the wages of low-skilled workers, that's new. And what's also new here is that we introduce a robot tax, because that's the second tax that we have here, and we simulate redistribution policies later on. I do not describe the solution of the intermediate goods sector and so on, that's fairly standard, and also only describe briefly the research and development sector, where we follow the ideas of Jones, 1995. So new technologies are produced with labor, but that's now the high-skilled workers that choose not to be engineers in the final goods sector, but scientists in the research and development sector. And their productivity is given by delta T bar, where delta T bar depends, as in the Jones model, on intertemporal knowledge spillovers measured by phi, and stepping on those externalities measured by lambda. And that allows us to solve for the rate of technological progress as a function of the number of high-skilled workers in the research and development sector, so the number of scientists. But in contrast to the standard models of Roma and Jones, we cannot solve for LHAT explicitly, because as we see on the next slide, we have a highly nonlinear equation that cannot be solved explicitly for the number of high-skilled workers. Instead, what we have to do is to resort to either implicit solutions or to numerical simulations. So if we assume labor market clearing, we have that the number of high-skilled workers in the economy overall is equal to the number of high-skilled workers in final goods production plus the number of high-skilled workers in research and development. The wages of them, the wages of engineers and scientists, equate in equilibrium, and we get an implicit solution for labor employed in research and development, so for the scientists, by this equation. And as I said, this cannot be solved explicitly. We have to do it implicitly and can derive nevertheless the results for that, theoretical results with this implicit analysis. And then we obtain numerical results, particularly to simulate redistribution policies also during the transition phase to the long-run equilibrium. So this framework then leads to 5 central insights. The first one is that automation raises productivity growth and growth of per capita GDP and incomes. That's not so surprising. That mainly replicates the findings of Roma and Jones with the interpretation that we have for the new technologies as automation. But then we have the results 2 and 3 that relate to wage inequality and the decrease in the labor income share that cannot be shown in the standard Roma-Jones type of endogenous and semi-endogenous growth models. In our case, the wages of low-skilled workers rise by less than the wages of high-skilled workers during the transition to the long-run balanced growth path, and in the long run, the wages of low-skilled workers even stagnate, while the wages of high-skilled workers still rise. So this explains wage inequality, and at the same time, it also explains that the labor income share is declining because the part of low-skilled workers becomes less and less relevant, while overall GDP still increases. So during the transition, the labor income share would decrease, but converge to a positive constant in the long run because the high-skilled labor share would still be positive. However, 2 and 3 imply that the model can explain a declining labor income share and rising wage inequality, as the previous very simple model could explain, and as it is consistent with the empirical evidence. What we also have here is wealth heterogeneity, because the share of wealth held by high-skilled workers also rises in the model, and this is again consistent with empirical findings, for example by Thomas Piketty and co-authors, that wealth concentration actually rose over the past decades. And finally, we can also explain something different that we could not explain with the basic model, and that is skill upgrading, or a certain race between education and technology. People try to upgrade their skills by obtaining a university degree because they observe stagnating wages when they remain low-skilled. So a larger and larger share of the population obtains a college degree, but this share converges to a constant to some extent because we have this ability threshold. So this would imply in reality that we see an increase in the share of graduates, but the increase levels off. So the increase over time is concave. And that's actually what we see in the data for the United States. So these are the central analytical results that are in line with the analytical results from the very simple framework, the Solowian framework, and they are in line with empirical evidence. Now these results of the model show that actually certain policy challenges emerge. We have seen that predominantly high-skilled workers or wealthier people who own the production factors, the capital, the robots, they benefit from automation, while the low-skilled workers would suffer. And that, of course, leads to the immediate question whether we can design redistributive policies that help the low-skilled workers without sacrificing growth too much. So whether there is something that we can do to circumvent an equity efficiency trade-off. And the robot tax is often mentioned as a policy that we should implement in this context to make kind of the level playing field between workers and robots. And what we do is to analyze the implications of such policies within the realm of the model. So we solve the model numerically from 1950 to 2100 over 6 generations, because we assume a generation length is 25 years. And we have that the solid blue line is the baseline solution of the model where taxes and transfers are set to 0. And that's until the year 2000, so that the tax rate is equal to 0. Then we assume 2 scenarios. In the year 2000, a redistribution policy is enacted that redistributes towards the low-skilled workers. So T, uppercase T, L is positive then. And we assume that this is either financed by a wage tax, then the solution of the model is the red dashed dotted line, or by a robot tax, then the solution is the green dashed line. Now we assume that the robot tax is 5%, and the wage tax is the equivalent tax, or the tax that would lead to the same revenues actually, and that's a 10.3% wage tax actually. Now what we see here, let's start with the lowest diagram, that is the income of low-skilled workers. We see that this increases sluggishly until about 2000 in the baseline simulation, and then it stays constant because we reached the long-run balanced growth path where no additional workers become high-skilled. So in the long run, the low-skilled would not benefit from technological progress. If we design the redistribution policies, then they do, and their incomes rise. And even pre-tax income inequality would be less. So that's the pre-tax income ratio of low-skilled divided by high-skilled wages, because basically it's the case that fewer people become high-skilled, because it's a kind of a subsidy that we have here for not getting educated. This is also what we see in the share of graduates. It's lower when we enact the redistribution policy, and therefore also the research and development share and DFB growth is lower in this case. So what we have here is actually a classical equity efficiency trade-off. We can reduce inequality, post-tax, but also pre-tax by enacting these policies, but that comes at the expense of sacrificing economic growth. What we also see here is that if we finance the redistribution by robot tax, the effect is stronger. So the inequality reducing effect is stronger, but also the growth reducing effect is stronger. And the reason for that is that the robot tax disincentivizes research and development further, because it taxes the outcome of research and development, the new varieties of machines or robots. But the bottom line here is there is no silver bullet. So policies that are often suggested, such as the robot tax, also come, of course, with trade-offs that we have to solve at the political level mainly. Another policy that is often suggested is an education subsidy to get more people into the education process, basically, or to upgrade their skills. Now that's also what we simulate, again, financed by either a robot tax or a wage tax. And what we see here when we look at the last diagram is that the low-skilled workers would actually suffer by even more because they pay the taxes, but those who remain low-skilled, because they cannot upgrade their skills due to ability constraints, they would suffer even more, because then they are even worse off in their after-tax income than without the redistribution, without the education subsidy. But in exchange, we get, if we finance the tax with a labor income, if we finance the redistribution with a labor income tax, we get an increase in the share of graduates, an increase in research and development, and an increase in TFP growth, at least during the transition. In the long run, it would not change, because in the long run, so even if we subsidize education, we hit the ability threshold, and from then onwards, no additional people can obtain a college degree. Okay, so again, it's an equity efficiency trade-off. We can get a little bit more growth, particularly during the transition, but we sacrifice for this by having more inequality, particularly in post-tax incomes. However, what is maybe a little bit surprising in this context is that if we finance this education subsidy with a robot tax, then actually the effect of the robot tax on research and development, so the disincentivizing effect there, even overcompensates for the education subsidy. So if we have this education subsidy but finance it by robot tax, we would even have fewer graduates, because the disincentivizing effect on research and development and on the increase in the skill premium then as a knock-on effect is just stronger than the direct subsidy effect. So we can now come to the conclusions. As we've seen, automation leads to rising productivity and incomes in the basic framework, as well as in the extended endogenous growth framework with endogenous skill upgrading. But it also leads to a declining labor income share and rising income and wealth inequality. In a more sophisticated framework, it can explain an increasing share of college-educated workers over time, but overall, particularly the unemployment effects remained less clear. Overall, this is very much consistent with the empirical evidence. For the first 4 items here, that's completely consistent, and the 5th item, as I said, there the evidence is also inconclusive, so there is also kind of not a contradiction between the models and the data. What we can definitely state is that low ability types, those who cannot upgrade their skills, the low-skilled workers, would definitely be the ones that lose the race against the machine. And that kind of leads to the policy challenges that emerge in this context, where we've seen that there are no easy solutions actually. So even some of the solutions often proposed come with trade-offs and may have also undesired side effects, such as a robot tax coupled with an education subsidy that actually leads to less education. But are there some potential solutions that could help that we probably did not analyze in this model sufficiently well? Or maybe that would follow from the model directly, even without introducing them formally. Well, one such policy is definitely straightforward, and that is raising the abilities in the first place. So, for example, investing in preschool or compulsory schooling, which becomes more and more important in the age of automation to increase the average ability level such that more and more people are actually enabled to obtain a university degree in the long run. This also relates, for example, to investments into the children's and women's health, particularly for disadvantaged groups, because we know that early health investments can help quite a lot for later school achievements. So that's very important and straightforward. I would say that follows also from these models. Another thing is that we've seen that the taxes that we introduced here mostly led to inefficiencies that kind of either reduced labor effort or education and so on. But in reality, of course, we also have things that we would want to tax. So Pigouvian taxes on, for example, environmental damage or CO2 emissions, particularly in the age of digitalization, when the new technologies require more and more resources, energy resources, and electricity and so on. So that could be a potential policy to tax CO2 emissions and redistribute the proceeds towards those who suffer from automation. And finally, consumption actually, if you have a consumption tax, that is usually less distortive than labor income tax, but we know it is regressive. So it has even worse effects on inequality. However, some have proposed a progressive consumption tax, and I find this idea quite intriguing. So Robert Frank, for example, argued that what you could do is that currently at the end of the year, we report to the tax office what we consumed, that is tax deductible, and deduct this from our income to pay a progressive income tax rate on the rest. But it could also be the way that we report to the tax office what we saved during a year, and the difference between income and savings would be consumption, and the progressive rate is applied on consumption, which would even have the additional advantage that tax fraud or bringing your savings to the Cayman Islands would not pay off anymore. Actually, it would increase your tax liabilities in this case. Of course, this is a very nice idea, but difficult to implement. But I would say that in reality, we also have progressive elements in the consumption tax. We have different rates in the European Union with which different items can be taxed. And this could be used to make the system more progressive, for example. So you have something, a lower tax rate for basic needs and a higher tax rate for luxury goods or something like that. Or we have it in case of cars, that larger cars are typically taxed at a higher rate, or more polluting cars, and that would also be such an element. But I think overall there are many things to think about in this context. And yeah, I just thank you for your attention.